Welcome back to Don't Forget the Champagne. I'm Nichelle, and this is Wedding Planning 101. Today we are going to be talking about caterers and your catering team. And I think this is like the part of the wedding where the budget starts to go off the rails if you're not planned ahead, or it can really make or break your wedding day. Food is one of the things guests remember most often. It's one of the things I see highest on, or most often, on couples' priority lists. It's a big deal. You want to have good food. That's an important part of a good wedding. So we're going to just be talking about kind of the food aspect of catering. We will get into alcohol and do a whole video on alcohol at some point, but not today. So first thing we're going to talk about is there are like 5-ish styles of catering. There are probably more that I'm not thinking of, but I think these are the 5 main styles that I see most often at weddings. So the first one is a full service caterer. So this is going to be your traditional wedding caterer. It's going to include servers and people that bust the tables and all of that jazz. And we love a full service caterer. They're thebomb.com. And that can mean that they do kind of traditional wedding food, or there also are full service caterers that do everything from like barbecue to like pizza. But a full service caterer will include all the servers, all the bussing. They're the one who like deal with setting up the buffet table if you're doing buffets, or serving the people if you're doing a plated dinner. They're the one who clears everything. They like take care of all the stuff for you, and we love them. But they're definitely the most expensive. Other option is a drop-off caterer. So again, this can be kind of like a wide range of things, from like someone who, like your local restaurant, a lot of times the catering they do is drop-off catering, and it can be like pretty much any type of food. So the biggest thing with drop-off catering is they're not going to include a staff, and you really do need some people to do some stuff. So you will have to hire additional people to bus tables, to set up the buffet, things like that. So drop-off catering is going to add another element down the road. It'll definitely be cheaper to do the drop-off catering, but sometimes once you add in those service costs, it'll wind up adding up pretty quickly, and it is incredibly difficult to do without hiring at least a few people to help with bussing tables, taking the trash out, making sure all the things happen the way they're supposed to. The third option I have is in-house or a restaurant. So if you were hosting your wedding at a restaurant, then probably the restaurant is going to be catering it. So you will have servers, you'll have people to bus tables, but they might not be as familiar with the wedding structure, especially if this is a restaurant that doesn't typically do weddings. So depending on how you set that up, you might have to have a few more conversations about making sure that they can get the food out in a timely manner, that they understand kind of what the flow of the wedding day should look like. So there might need to be a few more conversations about timing. If they're in-house and typically do weddings all the time, then you're probably like golden, because they're familiar with the space and familiar with how to do a wedding. So like bang, bang, boom, you don't have to worry about it. Another option that we see pretty frequently and is becoming more and more popular is a food truck. So this is going to lend itself to a more casual wedding. There are a couple problems that you could run into with food trucks. Timing can be really hard because people are typically ordering one at a time. So you want to make sure there's really limited options and that they can get things out quickly. So ideally you want to work with a food truck that has done other events and probably other weddings before. Another thing to keep in mind with food trucks is you are not going to have people to clear things away at the end of the night. You would assume that people would know to like throw their things away if you're doing like paper disposable things, but they struggle. So you're going to probably need 1 or 2 people that'll just go around and like bus tables at the end of the night, or kind of as the night goes on, as people move from eating to dancing. You want to make sure that flow makes sense, and that might just be like your day of coordinator, that might be someone at your venue. You'll have to figure it out. Sometimes those people can take that role, but you want to make sure that's really clear. Again, something to keep in mind when you're not doing something that includes servers is you're also not going to have people that include clearing the things away. And then the last type of catering we're going to talk about today, and we're really going to talk about it very briefly because I'm not familiar with it. I've never worked a wedding where this has happened, is self-catered or family catered, where your family and yourself are creating all the food. This sounds incredibly stressful to me. Again, you're not going to have that staff to help you deal with all of the things. Also, then the people who are in charge of the food aren't going to be able to fully enjoy the day. But it could possibly work, especially if you're having a smaller wedding. Like I said, I've never worked one that has been self-catered. Normally you don't hire a planner if you're self-catering. That typically that means you're in more of a DIY type of person. But I'm sure it could work. I just don't know how. There are plenty of resources online if that is something that you want to look into. And then let's talk about the type of meals. So beyond just the caterers and the catering team, there is a few different ways that you can get the food into the people's mouths. So the first one will be a plated meal. So that's where servers are going to come out and put the food in front of the faces of the people. This is going to require a larger wait staff because you have to get all the food out around the same time, but does reduce the amount of other issues you have to deal with, and actually sometimes can be a little bit cheaper just because you have to provide less food because you know exactly how much everyone is going to be eating. This is normally when you'd have that like chicken or beef and people would check on their RCP card, so you'll know ahead of time. The next option, and the option that is probably the most common, is a buffet option. So this option is nice because you have less servers, probably like very few, mostly just to kind of make sure the buffet continues to move, to switch out food as things get taken, and then also to help clear tables. So the serving staff is a little bit smaller, so that cost is smaller, but you do have to have more food because you can't completely anticipate how much everyone is going to eat, which options are going to go the fastest, that sort of stuff. Another option that is kind of halfway between plated and a buffet is family style, and that's where large plates are going to be provided to each of the tables that like everyone will share. So this is really common with things like pasta and things like that, where you can have a couple different types of pasta. People can grab what they want, but they're not having to get up to the buffet to go get it. So food costs are similar to buffet, and wait staff costs are similar to plated. So I would say family style tends to be one of the more expensive options, just because you have kind of a higher end on both levels, food and staff. And then the last one, and one that I wasn't super familiar with until recently, is station. So instead of having a like full meal, you like still have all the meal stuff, but there's no like sit down and eat time. You have some areas where people can eat, but also people can kind of like grab things as you go. So you can do this with like appetizer stations, or you can do like a full dinner of stations, but it really creates a unique environment for people to kind of mix and mingle and socialize, and can be really fun. Your wait staff cost, you're gonna have to have staff at all the tables, so depending on how many stations you have, that can be, I would probably say, a little bit more than buffet, but probably not quite as much as plated. And then your food costs are going to be similar to buffet, since you're not really going to be able to anticipate how much people are going to be eating of each thing. Okay, now let's talk about the food and what you should think about as you are picking your food. I think you can have whatever you want. This is your wedding, so if you want to have ice cream sandwiches only, you should be able to do it. First thing I think you should do is look over the menus for the specific catering companies you are looking at. And you want to also ask to see how many adjustments can you make. Do you need to go strictly off menu? Will they make a dish that you like make up and recommend to them? How closely to the menu do you need to be? And also make sure you're looking at the menu for the season your wedding's going to be in. A lot of times we get the menu that like they're currently using, but if you're looking at menus in February and your wedding is in October, the meals are probably going to be pretty different. I think most of the time catering companies are pretty good about giving you the right menu, but make sure that you are looking at the correct season, particularly if you're wanting to do something that's a little bit more locally sourced. Obviously, what's available in the springtime is not going to be available in the fall, and vice versa. So make sure you're looking at the appropriate menu for your season, and then talk with the catering team about how many adjustments you can make to that menu once you have it. I also think it's important to ask about special meals. How do they handle that? Can you do meals for people who have dietary restrictions, kids meals, vendor meals? What do those look like? You'll want to ask about pricing, but also just kind of like, how do they do that? And then I want to do a note about tastings, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about tastings, because it doesn't always look like what it does in the movies. Unfortunately, you can't just like book a tasting most of the time. almost always you have to be under contract with the specific caterer before you book the tasting. And there's almost always an additional fee for that tasting per person. And if there's not, it's probably built into your contract somewhere, because those are expensive. They're probably making you multiple meal options. And so that just to cover like food costs, and also to make sure that you're not just like going everywhere and getting tastings, they want to make sure you're under contract and that you kind of cover some of those food costs. If you are worried about your food tasting good before you book someone and you want to like, you're like, well, I can't do a tasting until after I'm under contract, but once I'm under contract, I'm stuck with them. See if, one, there's a clause for you to be able to exit the contract. What does that look like? I think it's always important to look at a cancellation policy in case somewhere down the road you'll realize that this is not the vendor for you. And also make sure to ask, one, about recommendations, or if there's another place that you can eat their food. A lot of times catering teams will cater like wedding mixers where couples can meet with different vendors, or they will be at like a bridal show and you can sample some of their food. Another thing that I think is hugely important, especially for caterers, is looking at reviews and recommendations. And I think for caterers particularly, you want to look at reviews and recommendations that come from other vendors. So particularly your venue staff. Ask them for recommendations, because not only do they know if the food tastes good, because most of the time they get a vendor meal, they're also going to know if this catering team is timely, is their staff very professional, do they make a huge mess, were they really good about cleaning? A lot of times those things might not be picked up on by the couples. If the food is super delicious, they might not know that their vendor team was like, oh my gosh, these caterers are running super late, or they were super unprofessional behind the scenes, or they were like kind of like a mess backstage behind the scenes wherever they were setting up catering. So I think it's really important to, particularly with caterers, talk to your team of vendors that you already have set in place, whether that's your planner, your venue coordinator, even photographers. Like, they'll see the behind the scenes and they'll know whether a caterer is good. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about with your catering team is cost. So like I said, this is where I typically see budgets go awry. And why I always recommend, before you book your vendor, you look into the recommended or required catering team, because catering is going to be a large chunk of your budget. Even if it's not a priority, it's going to be a pretty hefty sum, just because you have to feed all these people. And typically you think about catering as like cost per head, and I think $50 to $100 is pretty average for most weddings. So you can multiply that by how many guests you have, and you can see why it would be pretty expensive. So there are definitely cheaper ways to do it, but if you're going with a regular full service caterer, that's probably what you're looking at. So let's talk about prices and how to kind of understand prices, because I think people get confused and they look at the price per plate, which is a lot of times what the catering team will tell you up front, and they're like, oh great, I have, you know, a $25 price per plate and I have 100 guests, that's going to be $2,500. Unfortunately, that is not the whole catering price. As we talked about, there's a lot of things that go into catering. So you definitely want to look at the price per plate, and you also want to check in with them and see what the cost of vendor meals are going to be. Do they do a separate price for kids meals, and things with dietary restrictions? That way you can get kind of a better picture of what the food costs are going to be, but that really truly is only food costs. What you want to do is get a full quote from your catering team, and you want to make sure that your full quote includes any service fees that you're going to include. It's going to also include cake cutting, anything like that, and if possible, gratuity, because just like at a restaurant, you're typically expected to tip 18 to 20%. Sometimes that is like in your bill, and sometimes you have to do that yourself. And if you're doing it yourself, you have a little bit more discretion, but you still probably want to go to the 15 to 20 range. But you do want to take that into account when you're thinking about budget, because 15 to 20% of like $5,000 is a lot of money. So you want to make sure you're taking all of those service fees, cake cutting fees, gratuity, all into account when you're thinking about your catering budget. Sometimes the service costs are more than your food costs if you're doing like a plated meal. So if you only took into account the food costs, you're going to be in for a real surprise when you're actual catering bill comes to like double that amount. So like I said, ask for a full quote, and then also ask them, is there anything that I should know about that's not going to be included on the quote? Maybe they don't include service on their quote. Maybe they don't include gratuity like we talked about. So you want to make sure you have a really, really full picture, and again, that you're comparing apples and apples. There's no industry standard for what should be included on these like price quotes. Typically I do see a pretty good quote. Caterers want to make you happy, so they want to include as much as possible, but you do want to double check and make sure those few things are for sure included. That is everything I have kind of on the basics of catering. We could for sure get into more depth if we talked about all of the different types and all the different variations and types of foods and things, but we're not going to do that today because this is just kind of an introduction. Hopefully your catering team can help fill in the gaps. If you have any specific questions about catering or anything about wedding planning in general, please feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you are interested in getting more wedding planning videos, make sure to subscribe to this channel. All right, I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.